Back on the Young Turks. Now we got a really interesting interview for you guys. It's with Dr. Louis Sorley. He's written the book A Better War, The Unexamined Victories and the Final Tragedy of America's Last Years in Vietnam. It's an exploration of the later years of the Vietnam War and how we might have actually won the war. Dr. Sorley, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you very much.
First, let's talk about your thesis. Can you lay it out for us as to what happened differently towards the end of the war rather than the beginning of the war?
Yes. In the first part of the war, after we introduced ground forces in July of 1965, the commander of U.S. forces there was a general named William Westmoreland. His idea was to fight a war of attrition. The measure of merit was body count. He hypothesized that if he could kill enough of the enemy, they would lose heart, give up, and cease their aggression against the South. And so he did that. But it didn't work because they kept sending more and more forces down. And meanwhile, he was pretty much neglecting two other key tasks: improving South Vietnam's armed forces so they could take over their own security eventually from us, and rooting out the enemy's covert infrastructure, which in the hamlets and villages of rural South Vietnam was keeping the people under domination through terror and coercion. He leaves soon after the Tet Offensive of 1968 and is replaced by General Creighton Abrams, who has a different concept of the war. He sees it as a war not of the big battalions thrashing around out in the deep jungle, but as a war of lots of patrols, lots of ambushes, lots of small units, not focused primarily on killing the enemy, but on protecting the people of South Vietnam. And so now the measure of merit is population security. And by the way, he says this has got to be one war where we not only conduct the combat operations, but changed in the ways I just said, but we've got to upgrade South Vietnam's armed forces, and we've got to get into that enemy infrastructure and root that out so the people aren't subject to terrorism.
Dr. Sorley, this is a very influential book, and now people are saying that almost everyone at the Pentagon has read it, the top generals have, and they're very influenced by this, and they think that this is the better way to conduct a war, and it wound up improving the situation in Iraq, and they think it could do likewise in Afghanistan. So that's why I want to explore the ideas behind it a little bit more. So in 1968, as you pointed out, General Abrams comes in and starts with a new strategy, a strategy that I think, of course, is smarter, a wiser strategy.
Yes.
How long did that go for before we retreated from Vietnam?
The period of his formal command was from the early summer of 1968 until he went home in 1972, 4 years later, to become the Army Chief of Staff. He was succeeded by General Fred Wyand, his deputy and close associate, who stayed then until we had withdrawn all our forces pursuant to the Paris Accords, which theoretically were going to end the fighting. We had, it's interesting to note that during the earlier period under General Westmoreland, we were progressively building up our forces, thanks to repeated requests from him, eventually well over 500,000. In the Abrams period, we were progressively withdrawing those forces. I think he may be the only case of a major commander of an expeditionary force who sent his army home before himself. So the last of our forces come out. The Paris Accords are signed the 27th of January 1973, and by March we've had to withdraw our forces. We do get our prisoners back, and so on. So my contention is at that time, thanks to the work that had been done by Abrams and Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker and William Colby heading up our support for pacification, South Vietnam was positioned to continue to defend itself and maintain its independence so long as we kept the commitments that we had made to them. And very briefly, those were three. One, if the North Vietnamese violated the Paris Accords and started further aggression, we would introduce combat power to punish that. We're talking B-52s, I think. Secondly, if the South Vietnamese lost major combat systems, tanks, artillery, aircraft, we would replace those on a one-for-one basis, as was provided for in the Paris Accords. And third and finally, we would maintain a robust level of financial support for the South Vietnamese for the foreseeable future. And when it came to the crunch, we defaulted on all three of those commitments. And when we did that, the outcome was no longer in doubt because North Vietnam's patrons gave them greatly increased support during the same period.
So, Dr. Sorley,
the instrument of that betrayal of the South Vietnamese, by the way, was the United States Congress.
So it's your contention that if without the betrayal, the political betrayal perpetrated by the United States Congress, that we would have won Vietnam?
Well, if the war had continued and the fighting had continued at some level, this will sound, this sounds a little strange, but at a sustainable, tolerable level, it would put it like that, because many insurgencies do exactly that. Then I think the South Vietnamese had a reasonable chance of sustaining themselves. Yes.
So a couple of questions popped to mind here. I mean, 68 to 72 is a long period of time.
Yes.
If that was the right strategy that General Abrams had and the others that you mentioned in the book,
yes,
why didn't it already work?
Well, I think it did work. The war, as you know, was a complex type, and there were two main aspects to it. One was sort of the guerrilla war, the counterinsurgency war, if you will, and the other was a main force war of conventional forces, let's say, locked in combat with one another. During the period from the beginning of Abrams taking command until, let's say, late 1970, early 1971, the guerrilla war was won. The infrastructure was rooted out. The people became freer. The economy prospered. We introduced a miracle rice, and they were able to sustain themselves agriculturally, as they had not been able to do earlier in the war. And so the response then of the enemy to that was to mount what we call the Easter Offensive in the spring of 1972, the equivalent of about 20 divisions in a blatant, overt conventional invasion across the borders into South Vietnam from three places. It was touch and go. We had sent home all our combat forces, with the exception of naval gunfire and close air support. And so with those assisting, the South Vietnamese were able to turn back that invasion and, in fact, inflict such severe losses on the enemy that it was 3 more years before they could mount such an invasion again. Now, the critics said, well, South Vietnam couldn't have hacked it without our air support. That's what won the battle for them. General Abrams would have none of that. He said the Vietnamese had to stand and fight, or 10 times the air power we had wouldn't have turned the tide.
But Dr. Sorley, without our air power and without our help, the infrastructure that they built over those 4 years, 68 to 72, seemed to have crumbled very, very quickly. So that makes me question whether we had really won the hearts and minds, if we had really built up enough infrastructure, etc. Well,
you're right to ask that question, of course. It wasn't a question of hearts and minds, because that was an issue of whether the people of South Vietnam supported the communists or supported the non-communist government. We saw the answer to that when South Vietnam fell, and 1 million people took to leaky boats, to so-called boat people, to avoid having to live under a communist rule. But remember that one of our commitments was if the North Vietnamese violated the agreements, we would reintroduce combat power to punish that. And as I suggested, we're probably talking primarily about B-52s. But not only did we not do that, but progressively over the period from the final withdrawal of our forces, when the Paris Accords went into effect, that's March 1973, until the fall of Saigon and the end of the war 2 years later, on the 30th of April 1975, progressively they were running out of stuff to use. They were even washing bandages. I mean, that sounds grotesque, but that's the situation that they found themselves faced with. And so, absent the wherewithal, meanwhile the North Vietnamese are getting greatly increased supplies from their patrons, the outcome was inevitable.
Dr. Sorley, we're unfortunately out of time here, but we'd love to have you back too. And we had Gordon Goldstein on the show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but his book is on a similar topic, obviously, and being read by a lot of people in the White House.
Let me just quickly say, I watched Mr. Goldstein the other day when he was on Book TV, and I was very favorably impressed. But his book is about the early years. He focuses on George Bundy, and that's during the same period when Westmoreland is conducting this unavailing war of the big battalions. So I don't think Mr. Goldstein and I are at loggerheads at all, but I do think we could have some interesting dialogue.
Oh, I would love to get both of you guys on the show and to foster that dialogue. So we'll talk to you off air, and we'll talk to him. We'll see if we can do that, because they're both very interesting books and a worthy debate. So we really appreciate you coming on, Dr. Sorley.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Young Turks. We'll be right back.